Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We are so glad that you, our community, have joined us here today. As you know, the purpose of our show is to talk about the lives and experiences of women. We talk about women experiencing violence, human trafficking, women in leadership and decision making. And we also like to create a forum where we can provide education and resources to our community. And so we're just very, very glad that you joined us here today. And before we begin, we do want to recognize and thank our Indigenous community. We thank you for allowing us to share in this space, to have these conversations. We thank you for your culture, your traditions, these sacred territories and lands where we're able to meet and talk and learn together. So thank you so much. Today, we are going to be changing it up a little bit. We're going to be doing a 3-part series where we're going to be talking about trauma-informed lens or approach. What does that mean? And, that is some maybe new lingo and words that a lot of folks don't know what that means. So we want to provide an education about that. So we're going to turn the tables a little bit today. I'm used to being the one asking the question and, having conversation with my wonderful guests. We're going to change it up today. My wonderful Deb James, who's the Community Development Manager here at the shelter, is going to be interviewing me today. And we're going to be having a conversation about what does it mean to be trauma-informed. So I'm going to throw it over to Deb. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you.
I know I'm in good hands with her today. And so
well, thank you for inviting me in. And yeah, I think this is a really great kind of a role reversal just to be able to utilize you as a resource and to talk more about some of the things we talk about at the shelter, every single day. And I think you're right. Sometimes we probably will refer to things and maybe other people, it's like, oh, what does that mean? Or, what do you mean when you talk about trauma? So let's start there. Trauma and a trauma-informed lens, trauma practice. Let's start with just kind of pulling that apart a little bit and diving in there.
So what is trauma-informed mean, right? So if you think about all of us and our life experiences, most of us, if not all, have had some degree of trauma experience in our life. And it's very relative. It's how we all define that for ourselves. And it's very much on a spectrum. So I think we can all agree that some events are incredibly traumatic. So childhood sexual abuse would be an example of that. Living through a war, witnessing war, serious car accidents, those are, I think we would all agree, very, very traumatic experiences that can happen for any of us. But it is very relative. So I could have something which other people may think is very, very minor that's happened to me, but my interpretation, my reaction to that can be very big, can be very large. And that might be really hard for people to understand. Boy, that didn't seem like a big event to me. Why is she reacting so heavily to that? But again, our traumatic responses to an event is very personal. It is very dependent on many things within ourselves in how we react to those things.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. I think people immediately go to, a traumatic event. And yes, it could be a car accident, it could be something, living through a war, like you said, but it could also be something that's, to me, traumatic. And, it might not resonate with somebody else the same way. So that's a really good point.
So 75 to 80% of Canadians have all experienced one traumatic event. And so how we grew up, how we learn to cope, what our resiliency looks like, will really determine how we move through that traumatic event. But if you are someone who has had multiple traumatic events in your life, you can imagine it becomes bigger and bigger. They are accumulative. They build on the last one and become bigger and bigger, which makes it even more challenging for people to be able to move through the traumas that they have, experienced, right? So if we think that and keep in our minds that most of us, if not all, have had a traumatic experience, at least one, others have had multiple traumatic events. When we think about a trauma-informed lens, it really does build an acceptance and understanding that most of us have had those experiences, and those experiences shape who we are as people, our resiliency, our self-confidence, how we interact with other people. All of those things come together to build who we are and also influences our behavior. And so trauma is very much on a spectrum for, all of us. We all define our own trauma in our own way based on who we are and our examples. And we will define that trauma very differently. And so I'll give you this example. I could be in a car accident, a serious car accident, and I survive and I'm okay. I may look at that in two different ways. I may say to myself, thank heavens I had seatbelts that saved my life. There's a resiliency in how I interpret that traumatic experience. Someone else may say things like, I could have died. I can't believe what just happened to me. I don't know if I'll ever get over it. And they carry a different perspective on that traumatic experience that they have had, which speaks to their resiliency, which speaks to their traumatic experiences that they've had in the past and how they have been able to or not been able to move through that. So our traumatic experiences very much will influence how we view situations that happen to us. So you can either have a more positive outlook to that car accident and thinking about, thank heavens I had seatbelts and they were working for me. Or we can be thinking about the what ifs and the just be stuck in the traumatic experience that we have just gone through. So to be resilient through trauma really speaks about our own resiliency and how we view that experience. So I know I'm going on quite a lot, but I want to make sure that we have a really good understanding about how trauma influences all of us and also then influences our behavior, which I know we're going to talk quite a bit about.
So I know there's different types of trauma. Maybe we can jump in there and pull that apart a little bit and talk about the different types.
So there is multiple examples of different trauma. And so I'm going to touch on just a few. It can be very, kind of heavy to really unpack them and dive in deep to that. But one of the ones that I want to start to talk about is intergenerational or historical trauma. So I think a really good example of this is residential schools. If you think about ongoing within generations, within families, within groups of people, there is a traumatic experience that can be carried from generation to generation to generation. And the Indigenous experience alone and residential schools is very much an example of a trauma that can be carried through generations and generations. We know that Indigenous communities have been displaced, that their lands have been taken from them, that, their self-autonomy has been removed from them in so many ways. And that we are seeing is carried through multiple generations, and so that is a really good example of that intergenerational or historical trauma that can happen within groups of people and families. And so I think it is really a good reminder for all of us when we are interacting with folks from the Indigenous community about having an awareness of the trauma that group carries. Another example is vicarious trauma. And so we certainly see this in our work here in the shelter because we are working and supporting women and children who have an experience of violence, abuse, human trafficking, sexual assault, childhood abuse. And so it is very challenging, of course, to be working with women and kids who carry so much trauma. It's very hard to listen to that every day. It's hard to see bruises. It's hard to see children crying because of watching their parents in very volatile relationship, right? And so if you think about that in those helping professions, in ours in particular, the trauma that women are experiencing and children can become our trauma. The trauma can land on us. And you can imagine our employees, we go home at the end of the day, we're still thinking about those horrific situations that we've heard about, those horrific situations, the things that we've seen, that we have knowledge of. It lands on us. It sticks to us. Trauma can stick to us. Yeah,
so what are some of the things, so say we have, frontline workers, social workers, who are watching today. What are some of the things we can do for ourselves to help unpack that a little bit, to leave it, still be empathetic. You still want to, help that woman or those kids, but how do you unpack that and go home at night and feel good with your own, family?
Yeah, and it is a really good question. And so in our 3-part series, we are going to be talking about the workplace and how do you build trauma-informed workplaces and really try to create an environment where your employees are whole and healthy and well, right? So we are definitely going to unpack that. But for a quick response to your question, the debrief with employees about situations that occur is vitally important. And I would say that's not one debrief, it's an ongoing series of conversations with your employees. It is also vitally important that we recognize our own trauma first and foremost, that we have done our own personal work and reflection on our own trauma so that we are healthy and well to be able to support others with their trauma. Because what can happen is, if you and I are working together, Deb, and I am counseling you, but I've got a lot of unresolved things in my own life, you start to talk to me about your stuff, your traumas, your situations, I'm going to be triggered. My trauma is going to come to the surface because I have not done my own work to work through that. And so we have to be in a really, really good place and seek out the resources and the support that we require to be able to continue to do our own work, right? We need to be well so we can create wellness in others. And so if you think about that vicarious trauma, think about all of the helping professions, healthcare, fire, police, ambulance, right? Counselors, crisis workers, right? Folks who are going out to counsel folks who are suicidal. You can imagine the things that they are hearing and seeing and how that can lay on them extremely heavily. They've got to be in a good place to be able to work through that so that they can help other people.
All right. Thank you so much, Teresa. We're just going to take a very short break. This is a fascinating conversation. We're talking trauma today, and we'll be right back on Rogers TV.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
It's Wednesday Night Hockey.
The ultimate midweek showdown here on Sportsnet.
Here we go.
Hockey's best go head-to-head featuring division rivalries that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Scotiabank Wednesday Night Hockey on Sportsnet.
Are you here for the full 60 minutes?
I'm here for that and maybe some overtime.
Sportsnet Plus. Stream live games, NHL highlights, and more. Sign in with your TV service provider or subscribe at sportsnetplus.ca.
Welcome back to Rogers TV. It's Deb James with Teresa MacLennan today. Barrie Women and Children's Shelter. We kind of flipped the tables a little bit, and I'm asking the questions. This is going to be a three-part series about trauma and the trauma-informed lens. We talk about that a lot at the shelter. We took the break. We're just going to come back, and we were talking about examples of trauma. I mean, we can say, I think immediately we go to, what trauma might look like, but it's very different for everybody, very subjective, and there's different types.
So we were talking about intergenerational or historical trauma. We talked a little bit about vicarious trauma and how that can land on service providers of any kind. And the other one that I wanted to just talk about, well, there's a couple, relational trauma. And certainly we see this here in the shelter. Women are coming in who have an experience of abuse or human trafficking. Children are coming in, they've been traumatized, and it is relational. It is about the relations that they've had in their lives. And so abused women, they loved someone and probably still do, and that person has hurt them greatly. So think about the trauma that can come from that, right? You have very high hopes that you're going to be in a relationship that's going to be lasting and successful and happy and joyful, and it turns out very bad, and the woman ends up being abused. We also see that with many children who come in who have experienced sexual abuse or physical abuse as well. So the trauma that they experience is because of the relationships that they have had in their life. So that's something very significant for us here at the shelter. I also want to talk about systemic or structural violence. And so that too is very connected to intergenerational or historical violence. If we think about individuals or groups, there can be systemic practices, rules, a cultural experience that causes harm, right? And so again, if we think about the practice of residential schools, yes, multi-generational, historical, but it is built on systems and structures that were put in place that bring about violence and harm and trauma to those groups. And then last one I want to talk about is developmental trauma. And so we can see this in the interactions that can occur between parents and newborns, children, infants. How those first years of life are critical years in brain growth and development. It is in those years that we learn to trust that a parent is going to respond to us when we are crying and upset. If that doesn't happen, it influences us in our building of trust in others, that our needs will be responded to, that when we're hurt and in need of help, that someone will actually be there. When those things don't happen because there's a breakdown between the relationship of parents and children, or maybe parents don't have the skills to be able to parent effectively, that can greatly influence the development of that child. What that can also create is an attachment disorder between the parent and the child. So the child never learns to have a healthy attachment to an adult, to their parent. And what that means is when they grow up into adults and they're starting to form their own relationships, and their idea of what a healthy relationship looks like is misconstrued. It is not built on a foundation of what a healthy relationship is that they were missing out on between parent and child. So they grow up into the world, they're seeking relationships that are not going to be healthy. And so it is vitally important in those developmental years that parents are responsive to the needs of their infants and their children. It builds self-esteem, it builds resiliency, it builds confidence in relationship that will carry them into their later years and in their decision-making about future partners. And so it is an incredible exploration. I took a specialization in my early schooling days in attachment and attachment disorders. And it is really amazing to see and have conversation with folks who don't have resiliency and self-confidence to be able to move through trauma. And very much we start to talk about as a child what their experience was and how they felt that they were parented, how they were responded to as children. And so it is quite a fascinating thing. So developmental trauma, and there have been many, many studies that have shown that when infants and children are not responded to over a series of time in those early days, it actually affects what the brain looks like. Physically, the brain looks different.
Wow.
And so it is just, like I say, an incredible exploration. And I think I would be amiss, and I'll hold 1 second, Deb, and also just recognizing shock trauma. And we talked about a car accident, right? We can all have those experiences where there's something that we didn't expect that happens to us, and our nervous system is in overdrive because we had no preparation for it. But we can also have experiences that we plan for that can also cause trauma. And one of those examples might be childbirth, that women are knowing what's going to have some idea about what's going to happen during childbirth, right? And something can go wrong, or it is more of a traumatic event than they ever expected it to be. And so shock trauma, a trauma can be something that, of course, we don't expect to happen, like a shock, but it can also be something that we know is going to happen, but we don't recuperate from it very well. Deb, were you going to ask a follow-up question?
I was just, as you were talking about developmental trauma, I can really see perhaps how there is then a connection to, almost generational trauma, how a mother parents or needs help with skills, and then how that's passed on to their children, and then because we do see young mothers coming back in that were actually in the shelter as a child, and we do see that cyclical thing happening, and I definitely can see how it's related to developmental trauma.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I was thinking about when you started to talk was, yes, we see women coming into the shelter with young children, young girls, and then we will see those young girls as adults coming into our shelter. So some message in relationship has transitioned to the children. And we can see that in young girls who will choose a partner who will not be a healthy partner for them. We can see that in young boys who grow up to be abusers themselves because they have witnessed that, they have lived in that. And so it's a really good point that, and all of the traumas that I have talked about, so developmental trauma, shock trauma, vicarious trauma, intergenerational trauma, can be very much interconnected. And so there's a lot of similarities between those different types of trauma. So again, when we talk about, okay, maybe all of us have had one traumatic experience, but maybe we've all had multiple different types of trauma that have happened in our lives. Mm-hmm. So I've had a developmental trauma in my upbringing, and then I experienced a shock trauma, and I have experienced vicarious trauma. All of those things build, and become so great and so big, almost overwhelming, and sometimes for a lot of folks, and we are going to talk about, too much for people to be able to handle and to cope with in their lives.
So who would benefit? I mean, I know, with the Barrie shelter, we offer trauma-informed training. We have a level 1, 2, and 3, and that's what this series is about. But who would really benefit? I mean, all of us would benefit from trauma-informed training, but who would especially benefit with this deep dive into this type of training?
So as you mentioned, we do a lot of trauma training in the community. And so in terms of the benefit, I think it's important for all of us to have a general understanding of trauma because we interact with people all the time in our workplace, in our own families, in businesses, in the community, walking through downtown. We are continually interacting and seeing other people. How can we have an understanding and empathy for other people that we are interacting with and have an understanding that they carry trauma. Because this is how it translates. We know that there is such an opioid and mental health crisis happening in our community. When we think about and reflect on the amount of trauma that we all carry, and some people have had a lifetime of traumatic experiences, what we know is that the coping skills, the resiliency, has not been built for those folks. They do not have it in their toolbox to be able to cope. And so many people will turn to alcohol, drug use. They're unable to hold down work. They're unable to have successful, healthy relationships because of the trauma that they've experienced. It is important for all of us to have empathy and compassion towards the life experiences of people, and in turn, an understanding about why do people use substances to be able to cope with the trauma that they've experienced. So I believe that this training in this conversation is important for all of us, especially for folks who have interactions on a daily basis with people in the community. So think about the business community. You're a downtown shop owner and you have folks who are unhoused, who are coming to your door, who may be under the influence, may not. How can you build your empathy and your understanding about trauma in your interactions with that person? I think about the helping professions. Let's talk about City of Barrie employees, right? Somebody comes into City Hall, I don't know, to pay a parking ticket, right? And they're really upset about that parking ticket. And they might be showing you that they're really upset about that. That person is carrying trauma that we know nothing about. How can you talk to them and be responsive to them in an empathetic and compassionate way, with an understanding that we all have these life experiences and we're carrying trauma? So the business community, service providers, counselors, of course, who generally have a pretty good understanding about trauma when you're in a counseling role. But day-to-day folks, don't usually hear about or think about trauma and how that impacts all of us, right? And so it is important for all of us to have this conversation because, when we see folks who are using drugs, alcohol, maybe are unhoused, we can pass a lot of judgment. We can pass a lot of shame onto those folks. They carry a lot of that themselves, that they certainly don't need us to put that on them as well. Those are folks who are carrying deep-rooted trauma and experiences. And we are going to have a discussion about how do you interact with those folks, right? And how do you be safe? And so stay with us because we're going to continue those conversations.
100% fascinating conversation. As always, I so enjoyed chatting with you about this, and I think this is just such a great way, just such a great piece of information to share with Barrie and Simcoe County. So yes, we are going to wrap this show, but this is the first part in 3. So hopefully you can stay with us for more shows.